in a hungry mood and you're looking for some food.
Hey, Dad, I'll pay my own way tonight.
Sambo's.
They weren't just restaurants. They were second homes, Friday night rituals, and the taste of a simpler, sweeter time we can't get back. Why did the places that once felt unforgettable disappear without anyone noticing until it was too late? Showbiz Pizza Place was not just a restaurant. It was a fever dream brought to life with animatronic bears and arcade buzz. Long before Chuck E. Cheese swallowed up the scene, this was the spot. The neon lights outside promised an escape, but it was what happened inside that hooked you. Giant pizza pies that could feed a birthday party army, tokens clinking in your pockets, and the legendary Rock-afire Explosion Band performing on that rickety stage like your childhood depended on it. There was something surreal about watching a gorilla with sunglasses belt out pop songs while you crunched into a slice as thick as a school textbook. It was loud, it was messy, it was unforgettable. And then one day, just like that, it was gone. Bought out, rebranded, stripped of its charm. But the echoes of that mechanical bear band, they live rent-free in your brain. Of course, not every 1980s night out involved animatronic animals. Some of them felt more like date night, especially if you ended up here next. York Steakhouse was the quiet kind of magic that only made sense if you grew up in the golden era of mall culture. You know, the kind where the smell of leather shoes from the department store mixed with the warm scent of sizzling steak. This was the place where a nice dinner meant standing in line with a tray like it was a cafeteria, only this cafeteria had thick red carpets and faux mahogany everything. You grabbed your utensils from a bucket, picked out your cut of meat from a chalkboard menu, and settled into one of those heavy booths with a linen napkin that made you feel like royalty. There was something weirdly comforting about eating steak while sitting under fluorescent lights next to a plant that looked like it hadn't been watered since 1977. York was where people went to feel fancy on a budget, but as malls started shrinking and food courts took over, York Steakhouse quietly faded into the background. Still, for anyone who ever dipped their roll into a side of au jus, the memory sticks. Now, what if your family wanted a little more spice than steak? You probably ended up here. Chi-Chi's Mexican restaurant had flair, flavor, and just enough kitsch to keep things fun. Walking into a Chi-Chi's felt like stepping onto a movie set version of Mexico, complete with bright red tiles, sombreros nailed to the wall, and waiters who carried sizzling skillets like Olympic torches. The fajitas were the main event, steaming, crackling, and guaranteed to turn every head in the room as they passed by. Kids were wide-eyed, adults were impressed, and no matter how full you were, you always had room for that one thing, the legendary fried ice cream. Coated in a crispy cinnamon shell and served in a puff of whipped cream, it was the victory lap to every meal. Chi-Chi's was the place for birthday dinners, first dates, and family outings that felt like adventures. But food safety scandals and a changing dining scene meant it all unraveled. One by one, the doors shut, the sombreros came down, and a little bit of spice left the suburbs. But not all chains faded because of scandals. Some were just too different for their own good. Rax Roast Beef tried to be more than fast food. It wanted to be thoughtful, even elegant, an oasis for the roast beef connoisseur. And if that sounds like a joke now, back then, it was serious business. The logo had class. The menu had ambition. You could get a baked potato with real butter or pile your plate with pasta and pudding from the salad bar that stretched like a buffet dream. The roast beef sandwiches were stacked, the booths were plush, and in some locations, you could eat inside a glass atrium surrounded by artificial waterfalls and faux palm trees. Some even had a champagne room, which sounds wild until you remember it was the 1980s. But ambition sometimes runs into confusion, and Rax never quite figured out if it wanted to be Arby's rich cousin or a full-blown sit-down experience. It tried to do too much, and in the end, it crumbled under the weight of its own salad bar. But speaking of places that loved doing too much, our next stop had popcorn on the floor, cartoons on the walls, and enough energy to fuel a second-grade birthday party. The ground round was chaos, comfort, and childhood all wrapped into one. It was the kind of place where parents could get a beer and a burger while their kids threw peanut shells on the ground like it was encouraged. Because it was. The floors were covered in crunchy peanut bits. The air was filled with laughter and the faint smell of popcorn. There were projectors running old cartoons on the wall and kids with balloons trailing behind them like little parade floats. It was loud, it was joyful, and best of all, it felt like no one was trying to rush you out. The ground round leaned into its identity, part sports bar, part family funhouse. There was even a time when the cost of your meal was based on your weight. No, seriously, it was all part of the strange charm that kept people coming back. But as dining trends shifted and the novelty faded, so did the chain. Still, if you close your eyes, you can almost hear the crunch of a peanut shell underfoot. But if you were more into burgers and football than cartoons and chaos, our next place might have been your regular haunt. Gino's Hamburgers was one of those places that felt like it had everything. A solid burger, crispy fried chicken, a shake thick enough to challenge your straw. But the best part? It was co-founded by an actual National Football League Hall of Famer, Gino Marchetti of the Baltimore Colts. That kind of crossover was rare back then, and people loved it. The logo even had a little football player flipping a spatula like he had just sacked your hunger. Gino's was particularly big on the East Coast. You would see the glowing red signs as you drove past shopping centers and think, yeah, we are stopping there. It had this casual charm, nothing too flashy, but dependable in a way that stuck with you. They even teamed up with Kentucky Fried Chicken for a while. You could get your burger and your bucket in one place. That is efficiency, 1980s style. Eventually, though, bigger names moved in, and Gino's fizzled out, with only a couple of locations hanging on in Pennsylvania and Maryland today. But ask anyone who grew up nearby and they will tell you, it was the real deal. And if Gino's was about hearty plates and gridiron glory, then our next stop was about indulgence. Lots of it. Shrimp by the pound, steak on demand, and wine that flowed freely. Beefsteak Charlie's did not want you to just eat. They wanted you to feast. This was the kind of place that dared you to come hungry, then dared you again to leave room for dessert. Their tagline was, "You're gonna get spoiled," and honestly, they meant it. With a full salad bar, all-you-can-eat shrimp, and unlimited sangria, beer, and wine, it was less a dinner and more a challenge. The vibes? Equal parts wood-paneled steakhouse and slightly buzzed family reunion. People went for birthdays, promotions, divorces, any excuse to eat until your waistband begged for mercy. And the food? Surprisingly solid. The steak was not exactly filet mignon, but it hit the spot. The shrimp came fast and endless. And the bread? Warm, crusty, and forgettable. But who was there for bread? Beefsteak Charlie's rode the wave of 80s extravagance until the bottom line caught up with them. Too much generosity and not enough foot traffic sealed its fate. But in its heyday, it was a buffet fever dream come to life. So if you thought that was decadent, just wait. The next restaurant stripped the glitz and turned hot dogs and tacos into a Southern California classic, with a name that only made sense once you saw the menu. Pup and Taco was one of those places that never made it all the way across the country. But for Californians, it was a staple. You knew what to expect. A wide menu, dirt-cheap prices, and a name that sounded like it was made up by a kid. Hot dogs, tacos, burgers, fries, slushies, they threw it all at the wall and somehow it worked. You could walk up, grab a chili dog and a taco, and be out in 5 minutes for under $3. The locations were easy to spot too. Those retro signs with the big red and yellow block letters were a beacon to beach bums and budget-conscious teens alike. There was nothing gourmet about it, but that was never the point. It was fast, it was greasy, and it was loved. So much so, in fact, that Taco Bell bought most of the locations in the 1980s, essentially absorbing Pup and Taco into its own empire. The quirky name might be gone, but the spirit lives on every time someone adds a side of nachos to their burrito order. And while Pup and Taco ruled the roadside, our next stop was the king of the mall food court, soft, warm, twisted, and salted. The pretzel that walked so others could run. Long before Auntie Anne's took over shopping malls with that sweet almond glaze and cinnamon sugar swagger, there was Hot Sam Pretzels. This place was the original mall pretzel joint. The smell hit you like a buttery wall the moment you walked in. Their pretzels were big, doughy, salty, and piping hot. Perfect for tearing apart with your bare hands in between trips to the arcade and the food court. What made Hot Sam special was that it felt like it had always been there. You never planned to go to Hot Sam. You just walked past, caught a whiff, and suddenly you were standing in line. The classic salted pretzel was the favorite, but if you were bold, you went for the cheese-stuffed or even the jalapeno variety. They did not have 20 sauces or dipping cups. They had mustard. That was it. And it was glorious. Eventually, the brand got merged with Pretzel Time, and later, Auntie Anne's took over the pretzel game for good. But for kids of the 80s, Hot Sam was the flavor of an afternoon well spent. Speaking of things that left a taste and a legacy, our next stop is a little more complicated. A pancake house turned national chain, now remembered as much for controversy as it is for maple syrup. Sambo's restaurant was once everywhere. At its peak, over 1,000 locations dotted the American map, and for a time, it was the breakfast joint. You walked in, saw the tiger stripe motif, and knew pancakes were on the way. The food was solid. Fluffy pancakes, greasy bacon, big mugs of diner coffee. The kind of breakfast that left you needing a nap by 10 in the morning. But Sambo's legacy is tangled. Its name and branding, drawn from a children's book with racist origins, sparked increasing backlash as public awareness and cultural conversations shifted. People started asking hard questions about what a restaurant should represent. The food stayed consistent, but the reputation cracked. One by one, locations closed or rebranded. And while the last original Sambo's held on until 2020, even it finally changed names. Still, to many who grew up in its booths, it was not about the name. It was about pancake mornings with family and kids' meals with tiger-striped coloring books. But from syrupy stacks to something a little more British, the next forgotten favorite took a trip across the Atlantic and served up deep-fried nostalgia with a dash of malt vinegar. Arthur Treacher's fish and chips felt like someone dropped a British pub right into the middle of American suburbia, minus the beer and with a lot more deep frying. Named after the dapper English actor known for playing butlers in old films, this spot promised the classic British fish and chips experience, but with a crispy, golden American twist. The fish, flaky, crunchy, and always steaming. The chips, thick-cut fries that could double as a side or a meal, depending on how hungry you were. And do not forget the little tubs of malt vinegar that gave the whole meal a tangy kick. It was greasy comfort food at its finest, wrapped in paper and handed over with a wink. In its heyday, Arthur Treacher's had hundreds of locations scattered across the country. It was the place for people who wanted something fried but just a little different than burgers or chicken. Over time, competition and changing tastes wore it down. Most locations shuttered, leaving only a handful hanging on. But for anyone who grew up with one nearby, the smell of fried cod and vinegar still triggers a flood of memories. And speaking of memories, the next place on our list serves them up by the tray, with old-school charm, a flat-top grill, and a name that still rings out across the Midwest. Clancy's Hamburgers was not flashy, but that was exactly the point. This Midwestern chain was a tribute to the good old days. Think 1950s diner vibes with a 1980s sensibility. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, and jukeboxes that never worked quite right. The menu was simple: hamburgers, fries, shakes, and maybe a tenderloin sandwich if you were feeling wild. But the flavor? Solid, dependable. The kind of burger that made you feel like everything was going to be just fine, even if you still had homework due. Clancy's peaked during the Reagan era, when families were looking for a bit of nostalgia with their ketchup. The chain kept it local, tight, and grounded, mostly popping up in Indiana and surrounding states. While national giants expanded aggressively, Clancy's stayed close to home. That was part of its charm, and maybe part of its downfall. Eventually, as tastes shifted and bigger players took over the burger scene, Clancy's began to disappear. But it never truly left the hearts of the folks who grew up on its milkshakes and diner tunes. If Clancy's was the taste of Americana, our next stop had a flavor all its own. Crunchy, spicy, and bright red as a fire truck, all straight out of the streets of Los Angeles. Pioneer Chicken was not just food, it was a vibe. An LA staple with an orange and red glow that felt like it came from another world. The fried chicken here was unlike anything else. Its signature reddish-brown coating almost looked radioactive, but once you bit into that ultra-crispy skin, you got it. Tender chicken inside, wild crunch on the outside, and just enough seasoning to make you reach for a napkin between bites. People loved Pioneer because it was loud, bold, and unapologetically messy. And if you were anywhere near Los Angeles during the 1980s, you could not miss it. With Dodgers memorabilia on the walls and that blazing neon signage out front, it was practically a sports bar disguised as a fast food joint. It was the kind of place you hit up after a game, or on a late-night fried chicken run with your cousins. Eventually, though, the fried chicken wars heated up, and Pioneer could not keep up. Locations closed, memories faded, and only a few die-hard fans kept the dream alive. But once you have tasted that crunch, it stays with you. Speaking of flavor bombs, let us head to a place that steamed their hot dogs and beer and served tiki cocktails next to vinyl booths, an odd pairing that somehow made perfect sense. Lum's was born from a hot dog stand and became something like a fever dream of mid-century Americana meets tiki bar chic. Founded in Miami, this oddball restaurant chain made a name for itself with its signature beer-steamed hot dogs. Yes, beer-steamed. It sounds weird until you try it. The result was a hot dog with just a hint of hoppy goodness, nestled in a bun that soaked it all up like a sponge. But Lum's was more than just its dogs. It had fried clams, tiki drinks, and decor that made you feel like you had wandered into a vacation. Palm fronds, bamboo, and plastic parrots set the tone. The vibe was easygoing, slightly eccentric, and always a little bit boozy, even if you were just there for the onion rings. At its peak, Lum's had hundreds of locations, including one right on the Las Vegas Strip. But as the 80s rolled on, the novelty wore off and the chain dwindled. Still, if you ever sat down at Lum's with a giant menu, a plate of clams, and a tall frosty mug, you know it had a strange magic. But if Lum's was all about weird combinations, the next place made celebrations the main course, with parades, sirens, and a dessert so big they dared you to finish it. Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor was not a restaurant. It was an event. Walk into any Farrell's and you were met with a symphony of chaos. Waiters in candy-striped vests, marching drums, birthday horns, and people singing like it was opening night on Broadway. The floors shook with excitement. Kids screamed with joy. And at the center of it all was ice cream. Mountains of it. The Pig's Trough Sundae was the crown jewel, a massive dessert piled high with scoops of every flavor and toppings galore. And if you finished it solo? They rang a bell and brought the whole place to a standstill. It was part show, part sugar rush, and 100% unforgettable. Parents endured it for their kids. Kids loved it like it was Disneyland. But as the years went by, the charm faded. Maybe it was the noise. Maybe it was the cost. Or maybe people just stopped wanting their birthday to sound like a fire drill. Farrell's slowly melted away, leaving behind only echoes of whipped cream and clanging bells. And now that we have shouted ourselves hoarse with birthday songs, let us take it down a notch, because our next stop is as cozy as a cup of diner coffee on a rainy Pacific Northwest morning. VIP's restaurant was the kind of place that never made the national spotlight, but ask anyone from Oregon or Washington and you'll hear the same thing. It was like Denny's, only better. Cozy booths with cracked faux leather seats, mugs of coffee that never emptied, and a menu that served breakfast all day like it was doing you a personal favor. It was the sort of spot where truckers, college students, and night owls all blended together under the warm hum of fluorescent lighting. You could walk in at 2 in the morning and still get a full plate of pancakes, bacon, and hash browns that tasted like home. There was nothing flashy about VIPs, But that was exactly its charm. It was consistent, comforting, and totally unbothered by the fast-moving world outside. In the late 1980s, Denny's swooped in and bought up most of the locations, rebranding them and replacing that unmistakable local flavor with something more corporate. But folks from the Pacific Northwest still remember the coffee-stained menus, the quiet clatter of forks, and the waitresses who called you Han without blinking. If VIPs was all about comfort and familiarity, our next stop decided to flip the script. With rotisserie chicken, celebrity backing, and a brief moment in the cultural sun thanks to one very famous sitcom. Kenny Rogers Roasters was part restaurant, part marketing miracle. Sure, it launched in the early 1990s, but for kids growing up in the late 80s, it became one of their first tastes of what the grown-ups called eating healthy. It all started when country legend Kenny Rogers teamed up with a former Kentucky Fried Chicken executive to create a rotisserie chicken empire. The idea was simple: give folks a fast food experience without the grease and guilt. The chicken was juicy, slow-cooked, and served alongside baked beans, corn muffins, and coleslaw. It was comforting without being heavy, and the restaurant interiors had that clean, polished look of a country kitchen turned upscale cafeteria. But what really immortalized Kenny Rogers Roasters in pop culture was Seinfeld. An episode featured the restaurant as a literal beacon of red neon light, disrupting Kramer's sleep and setting off a hilarious chain of events. That spotlight helped, but it could not keep the chain afloat. Eventually, the brand fizzled in the US, even as it thrived overseas. Still, if you ever sat down with a tray of rotisserie chicken and Kenny's smiling face printed on your napkin, you know it was special. And from one Southern icon to another, our next stop traded the spotlight for something far more soulful: mason jars, cornbread, and country cookin' with a drawl. Po Folks was Southern hospitality wrapped in gingham and served with a ladle. You walked in and felt like you had stepped onto a front porch somewhere in Alabama. The tea came in mason jars. The walls were covered in antiques and hand-painted signs with sayings like, "Y'all come back now." And the food? It stuck to your ribs. Fried chicken, black-eyed peas, greens, meatloaf, and catfish, served with a side of cornbread and a whole lot of love. Po Folks made you feel like family, even if you were just passing through. There was a certain pride in the way it presented its Southern roots, unapologetically kitschy and warm. The prices were low, the portions were generous, and the vibe was always laid back. You were not there to rush. You were there to eat slow, talk loud, and maybe top it all off with some banana pudding. At its peak, Po Folks had locations across the South and Midwest, but as dining tastes shifted and the novelty faded, many closed down or rebranded. Still, that logo, an old-timey fella tipping his hat, lingers in the minds of diners who remember the hush puppies and home fries. But if you preferred your meals wrapped in foil and served with a little spice, then our next stop had just the chilito for you. Zantigo Mexican restaurant may not be a household name anymore, but for a stretch of time, it gave Taco Bell a serious run for its money. Founded in the Midwest, Zantigo offered something just a little different. A menu that felt more daring, more flavorful, and somehow more authentic, even if it was all fast food. The crown jewel was the chilito, a cheesy, spicy, burrito-like creation that sparked a cult following. You could argue all day about what made it so good. Some said it was the chili, others swore by the soft tortilla, but everyone agreed on one thing: it was addictive. Eventually, Taco Bell swooped in, acquired the chain, and folded many of the locations into their own branding. For years, the chilito lived on in whispers and nostalgia forums, until a small revival brought Zantigo back in limited form in Minnesota. But for most of us, it is just a flavor memory now. A quick lunch on a chilly day with steam rising from the wrapper. Speaking of wrappers and warmth, our next place was more than a pizzeria. It was a velvet-curtained hideaway with mob-themed charm and pizza that meant business. Godfather's Pizza was like walking into a gangster movie, if the mobsters were all obsessed with deep-dish crust and unlimited toppings. From the name to the decor, everything screamed themed dining, but in the best possible way. You stepped through those doors, and suddenly you were not in Kansas anymore. You were in a smoky, red-lit parlor with velvet booths, murals of Italian street scenes, and maybe a booth shaped like a carriage. It was a whole vibe. Families would crowd around wooden tables, pulling apart slices while sipping sodas from chalice-sized cups. The salad bar was an afterthought. This was about indulgence. And while Godfather's never went truly national like some of its competitors, it had a loyal following in the Midwest and beyond. As time passed, the branding got quieter and locations started to vanish, but those who grew up on its chunky crust and Godfather-themed ads still crave a slice. And if Godfather's was the high-drama pizza joint of the 80s, our next destination was a little more reserved, but no less memorable. With Tudor-style walls and steak that came with a side of class, it was the place you dressed up for. Steak and Ale was the go-to place for when you wanted to feel fancy, but still be home in time to catch a rerun of Magnum P.I. With its dark wood Tudor-style decor, stained glass windows, and hushed lighting, it gave off the vibe of a medieval inn, if the inn served salad bars and prime rib. You walked in and immediately felt like you were somewhere upscale. Maybe not five-star fine dining upscale, but mom's wearing lipstick and dad ironed his shirt upscale. The menu was packed with classics: sirloin steak, grilled salmon, baked potatoes as big as your head, and those tiny warm rolls that you could never get enough of. It made you feel like royalty, piling your plate high before the main course even arrived. For Middle America, Steak and Ale was the perfect blend of classy and casual. But while it may have been your parents' date night choice, the next place on our list was for the open road, the brightly colored beacon of every interstate exit, and the last orange-roofed symbol of a family vacation. Howard Johnson's restaurant was the undisputed king of the American road trip for decades, but by the 1980s, the crown was slipping fast. Those iconic orange rooftops once dotted the highways like bright promises of ice cream, fried clams, and a warm bed just a few steps away. Originally paired with motor lodges, Hojo's offered predictability in the best way. You always knew what kind of food and service you were going to get. That was comforting when you were hundreds of miles from home, tired, cranky, and desperate for anything that did not come out of a vending machine. Their menu was massive, with everything from hot dogs and burgers to spaghetti and fried chicken. By the time the 1980s rolled around, though, Hojo's was struggling to keep up with fast food and modern roadside chains. Locations started closing, and that once reliable presence faded into memory. And if Howard Johnson's was all about convenience with consistency, our next stop took the fast food model and gave it a cowboy twist, complete with roast beef, fried chicken, and a bar just for sandwich toppings. Roy Rogers restaurants were like a little piece of the Wild West dropped into your suburban strip mall. Named after the cowboy icon himself, this place stood out by offering more than just burgers. Sure, they had roast beef sandwiches and fried chicken that made fast food feel home-cooked, but the real magic? The Fixin's Bar, a glorious buffet of condiments, toppings, and extras that turned a plain sandwich into your own custom creation. Lettuce, pickles, onions, jalapenos, barbecue sauce, horseradish, you name it. It was all very yeehaw, but make it fast. For a time in the 1980s, Roy Rogers had a strong presence along the East Coast and highway rest stops, becoming a favorite for travelers and locals alike. Eventually, competition from giants like McDonald's and Wendy's squeezed them out of many markets. But those who remember still talk about it fondly, especially that legendary Fixin's Bar. And speaking of names that never quite fit, our next restaurant had an identity so split it changed from a queen to a druther, yet still stayed as comforting as ever. Druther's restaurant might sound like a southern euphemism, but once upon a time, it was actually called Burger Queen. Yes, you heard that right. Originally launched as a counterpoint to the King, Burger Queen had all the fast food staples: burgers, fries, milkshakes, but eventually decided it needed a new identity to stand out. So, in the 1980s, it rebranded as Druthers. They served up hearty burgers, fried chicken, and even fish dinners, along with breakfast combos that hit the spot. But it was not just about the food, it was the vibe. A lot of Druthers locations were tucked into small towns where everyone knew each other and the staff would greet you like you were part of the family. Sadly, Druthers began disappearing in the late 80s, swallowed by the ever-expanding reach of bigger chains. But in the hearts of Kentuckians and small-town regulars across the South, that weird little name still means comfort food done right. And speaking of comfort, our next stop is all about sliders, lots of them, in bags, at all hours. And no, it is not who you are thinking. Little tavern shops were not just restaurants, they were institutions. Tiny, green-roofed, late-night burger joints that invited you in with one legendary slogan, "Buy 'em by the bag." If you ever walked into one, you already know the drill. The place was barely bigger than a hallway. You sat at the counter, shouted your order to someone in a paper hat, and moments later, a white paper bag full of piping hot sliders hit the counter, greasy, salty, and perfectly simple. These were not gourmet burgers. These were soul savers at 2 in the morning. Originally started in Washington, D.C. in the 1920s, Little Tavern became a sensation in the Mid-Atlantic region. By the 1980s, it had hit peak nostalgia status. And yes, it paved the way for the slider craze we see now. Before White Castle went national, Little Tavern had already set the bar. Sadly, the shops started vanishing in the 90s, and today only the memories remain. But if you ever bit into one of those bite-sized burgers, hot and steaming out of a grease-marked bag, you know why we still miss them. Sambo's was made in 1957 all the way in Santa Barbara, California, and it had an extreme focus on capturing the market for families that wanted good, reliable breakfast options. It was a family restaurant chain known for its diner-style meals and its endearing pancakes, but how did they get their start? I'm not sure what the story was, but Sam Battistone Sr. and Newell Bonnet were the founders of the iconic restaurant chain, and the name was actually supposed to be a fusion of theirs. Personally, I think Sambo sounds a lot better than the other options that could come from those two names, but you let me know how you feel about that. Anyway, they were also known for one other obscure fact that I don't think a lot of you will catch. They were based off of the storybook known as The Story of Little Black Sambo, and a lot of their branding involved that, such as featuring tiger and jungle symbolism instead of outright referencing the book. Maybe because the book was slightly controversial, but the restaurant definitely wasn't, with 1,000 locations in just the 1970s alone. That is, until it did invite controversy. Eventually, Sambo started to become known for its racially insensitive branding, and despite their earnest attempts to rebrand into a more humane style of branding, it was unsuccessful, and it ended up closing down in the 1980s. The business practices it introduced are still followed by places like IHOP in America today, though, such as the idea of serving breakfast at all hours of the day. If we go on over to Miami Beach, Florida, in the 1956 time period, then there were these two brothers who really struck gold and no one saw it coming. The Blue Light special at Kmart wasn't just a promotion, it was an event. You'd be strolling past the patio furniture, minding your business, when suddenly, there it was. A flashing blue siren on a wheeled cart, followed by a loudspeaker blast. "Attention Kmart shoppers! For the next 10 minutes, women's terry cloth bathrobes, aisle 5, half off!" And just like that, people came running. Didn't matter if you needed a bathrobe. That blue light had a magnetic pull. Moms pushed carts like chariots, kids grabbed anything, and staff looked like they were hosting a game show. The light buzzed like it was short-circuiting from excitement. It felt like a flash sale disguised as a fire drill. People loitered near it, pretending to browse just in case. The intercom had its own charm, tinny and echoing like someone was calling deals from a submarine. Shopping turned into a strange kind of hunt. When the light shut off, game over, no do-overs, until the next round. But for something more hands-on and far more glittery, the real magic was just down the road at Ben Franklin. You had not lived until you beat the Oregon Trail without dying of dysentery. That was the holy grail of 1980s computer gaming. Those chunky gray computers in the school lab, that pixelated map, that relentless text box reminding you that little Timothy had broken a leg and your oxen just drowned crossing a river. Iconic, It was not just a game, it was survival. You learned real-life lessons in that pixel wilderness, like how much meat you could carry back from a hunt, not much, or why you should never try to ford a river without thinking it through. And somehow, we were totally into it. The green and black graphics, the clunky keyboard, the fact that it felt like schoolwork but kind of fun. You would all huddle around one screen, a group of 5 kids making group decisions like mini pioneers, and somehow it felt like the fate of your wagon family actually mattered. It was your first taste of choices in gaming, your first little moral dilemmas. Do you trade clothing for bullets? Do you rest for 2 days? Or do you push on and risk everyone freezing to death? Still, once the school bell rang, it was game over. And if you wanted to know what was playing in theaters that weekend, you did not Google it. You picked up the phone. Right out of the humble neighborhoods of the Midwest, specifically Mankato, Minnesota, Happy Chef, which first debuted in 1963, became known for its classic American diner fare, which included a lot of recognizable breakfast dishes and burgers. It also took some notes out of McDonald's playbook, as each location had this really eye-catching statue of the restaurant's mascot, which was a smiling, well, happy chef. The statue would be holding a spoon and a menu board, and some of those statues even spoke to customers, making it really popular with children. At its peak, it was around 60 locations strong, and those were more or less primarily in Minnesota and the neighboring states, but what it aimed to do, it did well. It had a regional grip that competitors couldn't shake off, and that gave a lot of other restaurants down the road the idea of having strong fan bases with your local regional communities rather than trying to capture a nationwide audience. At Osco Drug in the 1970s, the wall of film drop-off envelopes was like a time capsule in progress. You'd come in to grab toothpaste or cough syrup and be greeted by rows and rows of tiny paper envelopes, each one holding someone's memories, waiting to be developed into something magical or embarrassing. They lined the wall like library cards for your personal life. You'd fill out your info, seal the envelope with the film roll inside, and drop it in a metal chute that felt oddly official. The suspense? Intense. A week later, you'd return to flip through a tray of white photo sleeves, praying your vacation shots turned out and that nobody blinked during your cousin's wedding. Every visit to Osco meant passing that wall, each envelope a snapshot of someone's story, someone else's flashbulb moment. Sometimes you'd linger just to read the first names: Linda, Gary, Juanita. It felt nosy and comforting at the same time. And while the pharmacy section smelled like rubbing alcohol and bubblegum vitamins, that film wall smelled like mystery and anticipation. But Osco was a quiet sort of store. If you were craving something louder, flashier, and packed with racks of clothes being frantically sorted through under buzzing fluorescent lights, then your next stop had to be the Friday night phenomenon that was Mervyn's. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up, and even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector, and not just of stuff, but of memories. VIP's ended up being a chain of diner-style restaurants that was based in the Pacific Northwest, and it was founded in 1968 in Oregon. VIP's served ranges of classic American staples, which made it real popular with the middle-aged crowd that was slowly fading away into their twilight years. Burgers, beers, breakfast items, sandwiches. It was known for being family-friendly, which I'm sure you can tell a lot of these places were by now. That was just what the market was like. The biggest money was to be made with families, and a lot of diner restaurants focused on them. Also, because catering to families meant that one person could bring along 3 others with them if they suggested your spot as an idea, as compared to fast food places that would have menus better enjoyed on your own. It also followed in the footsteps of Wags, being one of the first players that were a part of the wave of 24-hour style diner restaurants. Later on, VIP would be acquired by Denny's, but even on its own, it became a regional hit in the Northwest as a lot of people could rely on it for consistent quality, affordable meals, and an atmosphere that was perfect for a relaxing night out on the town with your wife and kids. Safeway, in the 1970s, was a temple to earth tones. The logo? Deep orange? The signage? Creamsicle swirls. Even the carts were burnt tangerine, like they belonged in a shag-carpeted van. Safeway felt like a vintage filter. Everything had a warm glow that made even frozen peas feel cozy. Floors were loud, ceilings were low. The produce section always had one painted banana or smiling tomato sign hanging above. Bread smelled freshly baked. Red lighting made every steak glow like it came from a sci-fi set. Clerks wore wide collars and game show-style name tags. Groceries went into paper sacks that barely lasted the ride home. But those squeaky orange carts? Unforgettable. No power steering, just elbow grease, and if you had a sibling, they were the passenger. Safeway made shopping feel like an event. But for plush carpet and polite service, Tom McAn had you covered. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school, because chances were everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture, it all added to the mood. You were not just watching, you were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. White Tower was a fast food chain that was founded in 1926, and it copied what was known as White Castle, which was another big name in the burger-making industry. They were known for these small white burgers, and they expanded heavily throughout the 20s and 30s. What they were known for most was that lightning-quick service. I mean, seriously, I don't know what the hourly rate was back then for the service industry, but theirs must have been the best in the market, or at least pretty competitive, since those workers did their job like men possessed. You ever seen somebody move like Sonic the Hedgehog flipping hamburgers? A marathon, sure, but hamburgers? It's insane how different the work ethic used to be back then. Well, at least you could get paid fairly, so that's something. White Tower was known for having pretty good employee retention too, and it was one of the first chains to do a lot of things besides just set a standard in how you should treat your employees. It was extremely recognizable. Remember how I just talked about how Bob's Big Boy had its own air and personality that made it stand out? White Tower was really similar to that in that regard, and that's why no matter what the location was, it was always easily recognizable. Although maybe it was a bit too easy on the eyes, because people eventually compared it to another fast food chain, White Castle, and it even got into legal battles with them over how similar their product and architecture were. Guess you always should change up the homework you copy a bit more to be on the safe side, right? Walking into Sears in the 1970s was like stepping into a carnival. Before you hit the tools section, you were greeted by the smell of popcorn, peanuts, and caramel. Near the doorway was a stand selling wax paper bags of snacks and chunks of cashew brittle. The perfect shopping companion, made better by eating it as you walked. While your dad hunted for craftsman tools, you were busy trying not to drop caramel on your pants. Kids crowded the stand like it gave out free toys. The candy counter was chaotic and smelled like happiness. You could scoop ribbon candy or sugar sticks from big acrylic bins. Shop for a lawnmower, grab a snack, maybe try on shoes, all under one roof. That popcorn was loud, crunchy, and the soundtrack of errands. But just when you thought Sears had it all, Montgomery Ward dialed things up with a showroom straight out of tomorrow. Speak and Spell, a name so simple, you almost forget just how advanced it felt. This little orange learning machine had a robotic voice that felt both comforting and unsettling at the same time. The keys were rubbery. The screen was a small LED display, and the second it powered on, you felt like a kid genius. This was not just a toy, it was a computer. At least to us it was. And for a lot of people, it was the first time they ever heard a machine talk to them like a teacher would. It would ask you to spell elephant or photograph in that slow, mechanical voice. If you got it wrong, it would buzz like you had just activated some kind of self-destruct sequence. And if you nailed it, that same robotic voice gave you praise like it meant something, like it knew you. Speak and Spell was part game, part lesson, and 100% magic. You did not need Wi-Fi. You did not need batteries half the time. All you needed was the imagination to believe that this talking toy was the smartest machine in the house. And sometimes, it probably was. Of course, intelligence was one thing, but style? That was another story. If you were the kid with this next item, everyone knew you had your life together. Bob's Big Boy ended up being founded in 1936 by Bob Wien in Glendale, California, and it actually preceded Gino's and made a big name for itself at Gino's Own Game, which was having one unforgettable, phenomenal double-decker burger. This thing would turn even the staunchest of anti-beef believers into burger fans. I wasn't around back then, but my parents were, and they've seen that happen in real time. It also became known for something else my parents would never stop telling me about as they rant about how mascot culture is dead. That something was the Big Boy mascot statue, which is what people started to associate the restaurant with. It really gave it a sense of identity and a personal brand that set it apart from just another fast food place. Having an air of uniqueness like that can really help draw in customers, and if you're aiming to be a successful diner, you can never have enough of that. Bob's Big Boy ended up influencing a lot of diner culture, as its focus on a wide range of items like breakfast options, such as sandwiches, and comfort food go-tos like hash browns and burgers would make it known for being a family-oriented spot you could go to for a good, affordable meal. This is the same vibe and model that places like Denny's try to capture now. Radio Shack in the 1970s was the ultimate hideout for gadget lovers. You'd walk in and be hit with that plastic meat circuit board smell. The floors creaked. The walls, covered in wood paneling and stacked with speaker kits, batteries, and CB radios. It felt like your grandpa's basement exploded into a store. Every shelf had wires, switches, drawers full of diodes, and mystery tech you didn't dare pronounce. Kids checked out walkie-talkies. Dads vanished into the shortwave radio section for just a minute that lasted forever. The staff, half clerk, half mad scientist, eager to explain why you needed a breadboard and how not to burn your fingers. There were demo tables tangled with cords and blinking lights. The catalog? Nerd heaven. Not flashy but dense, every aisle dared you to build something. Even if you had no clue what a resistor was, you probably still bought one. And before you left, there was always that blinking red LED by the counter, daring you to bring it home. But for all of Radio Shack's buzzing chaos, JCPenney had its own multitasking flair. Back before virtual reality, Viewmaster Reels were the closest thing to teleportation we had. A small red plastic viewer, chunky and indestructible, that you held up to your face like some kind of sci-fi binoculars. But inside, whole worlds waited. You'd flick the lever with your thumb and instantly jump from a still frame of Mount Rushmore to a three-dimensional jungle scene, with elephants that felt like they could walk right out of the frame. Some reels were cartoons, others were travel photos, some were straight-up educational, which somehow made you like them even more. They were quiet, simple, and personal. You did not share your Viewmaster. That was yours. A private little universe. Every kid had their favorite reel. Maybe it was the one with dinosaurs. Maybe it was the space shuttle. Whatever it was your escape hatch from a math worksheet or a rainy Saturday. The 1980s weren't about flashy screens or downloads. They were about plastic, paper, light, and wonder. And somehow, that was enough. Actually, it was more than enough. But if you really wanted to feel like you were holding the future in your hands, you did not stop at a Viewmaster. You went for the gadget that talked back. A name that was founded during the glory days of Lums and ended up giving it some serious competition was Steak and Ale, which actually went on the other end of the spectrum. Norman Binker, the founder, built the first steak and ale in Dallas, Texas. The way this contrasted from places like Lums was that while they focused on experimental food and new ideas that Americans wouldn't get at other places, Steak and Ale doubled down on the concept of how much Americans love a good steak. The problem was that around this time period, a lot of families were still recovering from the back-to-back effects of the historically disastrous cluster of events known as the Great Depression and the two World Wars, so there was a need for restaurants to be affordable if they wanted to keep dragging in customers. Steak and Ale was the pioneer of this kind of steakhouse, and it featured traditional American themes and an atmosphere that screamed Texas, almost as if the walls themselves were saying howdy to you. Prime rib, steaks, pork roasts, all for prices that the competition couldn't keep up with. And then, to top it all off, an all-you-can-eat salad bar that was so popular with both people who were trying to keep in shape and kids who loved experimenting with different wacky salad combinations. Steakhouses were known for being pricey, fancy places you'd take the family out to, so Steak and Ale really did customers a favor by introducing the idea of an affordable steakhouse. Tom McAn in the 1970s was less of a shoe store and more of a fitting room on steroids. You didn't just try on shoes, you got seated, in a padded chair, by a man in a tie who measured your foot with a shiny metal contraption that looked like a tiny guillotine. It was formal, it was respectful, it was intense. The carpeting was deep enough to lose a penny in, and the walls were lined with glossy wooden displays featuring rows of loafers, Oxfords, and practical pumps in every shade of brown imaginable. The air smelled like leather, suede, and whatever polish they used to shine up the sample pairs. You'd sit politely while the salesman disappeared to the back, returning with a towering stack of orange boxes like some kind of shoe magician. You tried them on one at a time, walking awkwardly across the carpet while your mom and the salesman nodded approvingly. There were mirrors on the floor and tiny shoe horns on chains. It felt important, like choosing a suit of armor for your feet. But just beyond those plush floors and polished counters was a very different kind of store. A pharmacy where your toothpaste lived right next to a wall of mystery film envelopes. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic, "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories. Seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. NFL Hall of Fame inductee. Gino Marchetti and some of his partners came together in 1957 and came up with Gino's Hamburgers, first opening for business in the humble locale of Baltimore, Maryland. However, not so humble, it quickly became a fast food giant in the region. It was even known as Gino Giant, and part of that was because of that extremely towering, intimidating double-decker burger that would make even most grown men think twice about whether or not they could finish it. Gino's Hamburgers market was grown men, though, because it also had team-oriented marketing that was meant to appeal to NFL fans. It even partnered with the NFL and created a lot of leeway and goodwill with local sports communities and fans, and it even featured KFC chicken thanks to a licensing partnership with them. They had an approach to the fast food game that no one else had at the time, which was to build a solid community fan base and take full advantage of it. That dedication to regional success is still something that's echoed by a lot of fast food joints across America, and Gino's legacy lives on in all the places it's influenced. A&P. Grocery stores in the 1970s felt more like quiet temples than snack stops. The lights? Diamond soys. The floors? Scuffed wood and linoleum that creaked with every cart. Walking in felt like entering a club for whispering coupon clippers. The produce glowed under yellow bulbs, making apples look golden and oranges like tiny suns. You didn't rush, you wandered. End caps were full of store-brand peas and cereal boxes with judgmental mascots. It felt like a food library. The scent of fresh bread drifted near the back. If lucky, you'd score a cookie if you whispered, "Thank you." Cashiers used hand-cranked registers, and receipts looked like typewriter relics. It was slower and softer. But if A&P was a calm whisper, Kmart was a flashing blue light with a bullhorn. Saturday morning cartoons were not just shows. They were rituals. You would wake up at 6 or 7, bowl of cereal in hand, and stake out your spot in front of the television before anyone else in the house even stirred. Pajamas still on, eyes still half shut. But you were ready. The networks fought hard for your attention. ABC, NBC, CBS, they all rolled out animated powerhouses like The Smurfs, He-Man, The Real Ghostbusters, Gem, G.I. Joe, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Each show had its slot, and missing one felt like missing a holiday. But for every golden episode came the heartbreak of your favorite show being bumped, or worse, replaced. The dreaded special news report could interrupt your flow like a slap to the face. You would sit there in disbelief as your cartoon got pulled for a political debate or weather update. No warnings, no mercy. Still, the lineup gave you something to look forward to all week, and for those few hours, everything felt right in the world. Cartoons, cereal, and commercials that somehow got stuck in your head forever. Because let's be honest, there are still jingles from that era that we can sing from memory, word for word. While Burger Chef was changing the script as far as flipping hamburgers went, Howard Johnson's was making waves even earlier in the 1920s and revolutionizing how ice cream stands worked in America. It was a humble stand that started in Massachusetts, and it ended up growing into a synonym for roadside dining eventually throughout America. It became known for its family-friendly menus, which expanded far past just ice cream. When I tell you there was a Howard Johnson everywhere, please believe me, because I mean absolutely nowhere was safe from Johnson. I'm talking about interstates, every other main road, near subways, but there was one location where they were most popular, and that was highways. Their joints also had this infectiously charming appeal to them with those bright orange roofs that were so recognizable. They were one of the first places to set a standard for fast food that the rest of America would follow, and they still stuck true to their roots by serving some pretty good ice cream. Howard Johnson focused on becoming a recognizable brand that families could trust, and their entire business model was being a source of some great food even around places like the highway. Ben Franklin stores in the 1970s were creative chaos in fluorescent light and linoleum. Half craft shop, half toy store, part Candyland, you could find yarn, glue, and jawbreakers all in the same 5-foot stretch. You'd walk in and instantly smell wax paper, plastic, and Elmer's glue. Aisles were narrow and packed with glitter tubes, googly eyes, and popsicle sticks bundled like fancy lumber. Kids zoomed to the back for erasers. Adults browsed embroidery hoops and paint kits. Grandpa was up front debating towels. The checkout was a sugar trap. Jawbreakers, wax lips, candy dots, and gum cigars that dyed your mouth for days. You didn't just shop there, you scavenged. You came in for one thing and left with five. It was messy, a little dusty, and full of heart. And when it came to grocery stores with a bold love for color, none leaned harder into the 70s palette than Safeway. If one of these sparked a memory or made your stomach growl, drop your favorite in the comments, give us a like, and hit subscribe so we can keep cooking up nostalgia, one bite at a time.